exports of goods to the Euro currency area in 2011 totaled around $200 billion. That's about 13% of the total dollar value of U.S. goods exports. More broadly, exports to the European Union, including countries that don't use the euro, totaled about 18% of U.S. goods exports. A mild European recession, which is what I expect, would slow but not derail the U.S. economic recovery. While the trade channel, the trade channel with Europe is important, the greater concern, in my view, relates to the European financial system. In particular, the risk of an event that might trigger a widespread seizing up of global debt markets. Financial stress in Europe increased measurably after the failure to form a government following the last Greek elections. With increased fears that Greece may leave the euro area, deposit flight from Greek banks reportedly has surged. Sovereign debt spreads and credit default swap cost of protection have increased in Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Ireland. Against this picture, U.S. financial institutions have been taking steps to limit their direct European exposure. Banks have moved to limit their direct exposure to peripheral European sovereign debt, but they still maintain exposure to European banks through complex counterparty relationships, including their participation in the credit default swap market. Also, exposures of money market mutual funds to unsecured European debt actually have been declining in recent months, especially their longer dated, that is greater than 30 days, unsecured placements with European banks. The reduction of direct exposures within our domestic financial system has actually been quite aggressive, but can only go so far to insulate the United States economy from spillover in the event of financial sector instability in Europe. The global financial system is simply too integrated and too networked to expect that problems could be isolated to Europe. Also, arguably in the current, what the press calls risk-on, risk-off investment environment, U.S. financial markets have already experienced the effects of European risk in equity markets. Another related global risk is the apparent slowdown occurring in a number of large emerging economies, notably China, Brazil, and India. Our recent export strength is substantially related to strong economic performance in emerging economies. A growth slowdown in emerging economies would aggravate the effects of the European slowdown by further limiting the role of exports in the U.S. recovery. Those are the risks I see. Those are the most prominent risks I see. I should add, although I didn't mention it earlier, and although the intensity of concern has receded somewhat, that the risk of conflict related to Iranian nuclear proliferation in the Middle East has not gone away. Sudden developments there would likely be felt in oil markets. And research has connected the onset of recessionary conditions in our economy with spikes in oil prices. To close the circle, let me tie my view on the outlook to, and the outlook and risks to monetary policy. In thinking about the array of headwinds and risks out there, I can say that my base case outlook for the economy incorporates some of the impact of these downside forces on the economy. That said, the full potential impacts of a downside scenario related to Europe or a global economic slowdown or some other externally sourced shock are not factored into the outlook that I described. In the context of that outlook, policy remains quite accommodative and supportive of the ongoing recovery. The key elements of current monetary policy are an interest rate policy designed to keep borrowing rates at very low levels, a stable Federal Reserve balance sheet whose average maturity has been extended recently as a result of the so-called Operation Twist, and a communication policy that I think goes a long way in helping the public form expectations about interest rates, inflation, and the intent of policy overall. I view this policy stance as appropriate for the outlook that I described. However, as the employment report of last Friday illustrates, there continues to be a halting and tenuous character to the recovery. As I look ahead, my viewpoint on policy considers two possibilities. Should it become clear that something resembling my baseline scenario of continuing, though modest, growth is no longer realistic, further monetary policy actions to support the recovery will certainly be needed. In addition, the situation we face requires that the FOMC maintain a state of readiness to respond to financial or economic instability should the need arise. I'm confident that the committee retains the capacity to act and the tools to promote stability. And very importantly, and I'll close with these thoughts, the economy itself is in a better condition to withstand threats to stability than it was at the time of the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. I still think it's prudent to acknowledge a degree of fragility, but in its fundamentals, the U.S. economy has made substantial progress toward resilience. So with those thoughts, I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to entertain questions from the floor.
Any questions?
I'll repeat the question for those of you in the back. Yes, sir. The question is, what's the negative effect of not doing the Keystone Pipeline? In the greater scheme of things, it's a micro consideration, not a macroeconomic consideration. I am certainly no expert on it, and so I probably know what you read, and that's all I know. I know that the oil industry, believes that this is critical to getting Canadian oil to U.S. markets through the refinery system that is actually in the southeast. It's substantially in Louisiana and Texas, and so I know they very much favor it. And beyond that, it's obviously a political issue. And as a central banker, we try to stay out of politics. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Virginia Galloway, State Director of Americans for Prosperity. And when I started my job 6 years ago, our national debt was $6 trillion, and now it's around, $14 trillion? Isn't that reaching the level of our entire gross domestic product? And how does that, is there not a cliff there anywhere in that national debt?
Well, your numbers are accurate. The gross national debt, and I say gross because some of the debt is actually held by government entities, so it's holding debt on yourself in effect. And of course, a good portion, a rather large sum, is held by the Federal Reserve, which is the way we go about doing monetary policy on a regular basis. But nonetheless, the $14 trillion is very close to the $15 trillion size of the U.S. economy. So in a gross sense, that's approaching 100% of GDP. The conventional wisdom globally or around the world on debt levels is that a healthy level of national debt is in the range of 35 to 40%. And we were at 35 to 40% not too long ago. And now we are at something, let's say, well above that, depending on how you want to measure. There's been quite serious research done. A paper presented last summer at a Federal Reserve conference that argues that there's a sort of tipping point around 85% of GDP, after which the level of debt just gets in the way of economic growth. So clearly it's a serious concern. We tend, as central bankers, not to invade the fiscal space and talk about fiscal matters too much, or at least certainly not in detail. That's really the purview of the Congress and the administration. But I have said repeatedly, and Chairman Bernanke as recently as this morning re-emphasized the importance that Congress and the administration need to come up with a credible long-term plan that brings the level of debt into a more manageable level. So yes, I think it's a very serious concern. Yes, sir.
Relative to house prices, the home prices, what do you think about theory that instead of continuing the quantitative easing, you just let interest rates rise? The idea being that as more potential home buyers see the interest rates rising, they're going to run out and buy a home before the rates go up too high, therefore causing the house prices to go up, helping the economy, and also, of course, produce interest increases for consumers.
I'll paraphrase the question. I've had the question before, so it's on the minds of a lot of people. The gentleman related this to house prices or home prices, but you could relate it to business investment as well. And the thought is, if you let interest rates rise, or certainly announced a near-term date, you would end up with what you might call the fire sale effect. That is, people who would go out and do something because it's cheaper now, money is cheaper now than it's going to be at some point in the future. And to some extent, our communication policy has performed that role by going to specific dates. Last August, we announced that in all likelihood, interest rates would remain low until the middle of 2013, which, of course, now is only a year away. Then in January of this year, we extended that to through the last quarter, or the end of 2014. And as we get closer to those dates, if that communication policy continues, people are going to recognize that they may be entering a period of rising interest rates. This is a trade-off. We can only have one policy. I often hear a similar question around, aren't you hurting savers? Aren't you hurting people who live off of interest income? And the best answer I can give is we have one policy that's designed to bring the economy back to health as rapidly as possible, to reduce unemployment, obviously keeping inflation under control. And in our judgment, financial conditions involving really what are now rock bottom interest rates is one of the most important tools we have to nurse that economy back. And the economy coming back in an overall sense is in the interest of everyone, whether it be someone who's trying to sell a house or someone who's living off of a bank CD or whatever it may be. So it's hard for me to embrace the idea of sort of preemptively announcing an interest rate rise that would have conceivably a negative effect on the overall economy in order to get certain positive effects like upward pressure on home prices. So I'm not an advocate of that view, but it's a serious point of view that I've certainly heard frequently. Yes, sir.
I'm Steve Frederick. I'm a financial advisor. I make my living by suggesting people buy into this economy in the form of equities. When I listen to people who look at the economy from a macro level, the best I hear is very moderate, very slow growth. And yet, when I look at it from my end of the spectrum, I see companies with a lot of cash on the sideline, very lean operations, record corporate earnings, and where's the disconnect? I see the potential for an economy to get going pretty quickly. I don't know when that's going to happen, and maybe that's the disconnect between this very moderate, slow pace of growth and a number of elements that I see in place to maybe accelerate that growth.
If there is a disconnect, I would say that what you see when you look at individual, particularly large companies, and you would be looking at what are mostly public companies, so they are going to be the larger companies, only tells part of the story. They are, all things considered, poised for growth, but at the moment still rather cautious. That's the reason you have such large cash balances on the balance sheets of many public companies. And as their outlook becomes more encouraging, in all likelihood, some of that cash will come off the sidelines and be reflected in investment and we hope in hiring as well. The reason large companies are quite profitable, even in this rather slow growth economy, is because during the recession, and this is obviously a generalization, but during the recession, there was a really strong drive for productivity. So the layoffs that occurred have stuck in many companies, and meaning they have simply reduced the workforce for the same amount of work. And that is at least one definition of a rise in productivity. So companies are operating very lean, they're managing for cash, they are generating cash, and then they are not investing that cash, at least in investments that are expansion-oriented. And that picture, one hopes, will change, but it's going to change when the uncertainty factor shrinks. And when I talk to business people who are involved in larger corporations, they continue to say there's just too much uncertainty out there, whether it be related to Europe, as I mentioned in my remarks, or uncertainties that are more, let's say, more particular to their industry. And as I said, large corporations don't tell the whole story. Another part of the story is small business, and small business hasn't seen that same recovery of profitability. And so the small business sector hasn't had the same level of return to cash flow and profitability that the large business sector has. So I wouldn't argue that there is a disconnect. I guess I would argue that the business community is still very conservative and very cautious, and that is mostly because of the uncertainty picture out there. Thank you very much. It's great to be involved.
Thank you, President Lockhart, and we appreciate you being here today and coming out to Paulding County, and we hope you come back again soon. And I think we have a small gift for you right here.
Oh, he's a smart man.